Okay, let's get started. We are in lecture 11, and we're going to jump into the economics of HIV/AIDS. We just sort of almost got through it last time, so we're about a lecture behind. I'll try to catch up a little bit today. And then after we go through HIV/AIDS for a few lectures, we'll turn to education and human capital before the midterm. So I want to start just with a clicker question. Let's just do it before we kind of get into the data and get people's sort of view on what you think the average infection rate or prevalence of HIV/AIDS is among adults in sub-Saharan Africa. Is it 2%, 5%, 8%, 11%, or 14%? Hi. So I see a bunch of people clicking in. So just go for another 15 seconds or so. Okay, so pretty interesting answer. So most people put it at 11% or 14%. Some people at 8%. Very few at lower rates. When questions, more open-ended questions like this are asked, and we've done some of this in Kenya, and other people have done it in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and after they're asked this sort of question, what proportion of adults in your society do you think are HIV positive? You often even get numbers much higher than this. You can get numbers that are 25%. So I think this is really interesting. The next slide has or two slides down has the answer. The answer is actually 5%. So most people's view is that it's actually 2 to 3 times, the infection rate is 2 to 3 times what it is. And as I mentioned, sometimes people will even mention higher rates. What we have here are the infection rates in different countries around the world. So as of a few years ago, recent data indicates that over 30 million people are living with HIV. And as you can see by the dark colors, the most infected region is clearly sub-Saharan Africa. And there are countries with 15 or 20% infection rates. These really dark countries, but more are in this sort of 1 to 5 or 5 to 10 sort of range. On this map, a couple patterns come through even within sub-Saharan Africa. The southern African countries tend to have the highest infection rates. South Africa, Botswana, Swaziland. And there's quite high rates of infection in East Africa as well. They're going up to Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. But Central and Western Africa tend to have lower rates of infection. In some ways, this is natural because the view of most is that the first sort of human infection with HIV probably took place somewhere in eastern Congo, maybe 50, 60 years ago. There's epidemiologists trying to understand how the HIV virus passed from primates to humans. That's the hypothesis that's out there. And as they've gone through old medical records, they've actually found that even in the 1960s, there were a couple of cases of Belgians who had been living in the Belgian Congo, what is today Democratic Republic of Congo, who died in Brussels in the 60s, a very mysterious illness. But when they actually went back to the medical records of those individuals, they're just classic HIV/AIDS symptoms. So even 50 years ago, there had been some beginnings of the epidemic, but it really only became an epidemic and expanded in the early 80s. And starting from the Great Lakes region. So it is kind of natural that area would have had higher infection because it's closer to the source of the epidemic. Now, there are lower rates of infection outside of sub-Saharan Africa. This is a table that shows the infection rates. So in sub-Saharan Africa, infection is 5% on average on the upper right box up there. In 2009, over 1 million Africans died of HIV, and there were 1 million to 2 million new infections, and about 22 million sub-Saharan Africans were infected. So that's the bulk of the global infection total of 33 million. And in the rest of the world, infection rates are 1% or below. So even though the 5% was lower than most of you thought prevalence was in sub-Saharan Africa, that's still really an order of magnitude higher of an infection rate than you find in other parts of the world. And again, most plausibly, that's related to the fact that the epidemic started in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where a lot of the early infection was. That's where the spread of the disease was. And so still a lot of the infection is concentrated there. And the sort of best estimates out there, something like 1% or a little under 1% of the adult population in the world is HIV positive. What are some other patterns, if any, that you find striking here as you look across different regions and these different sort of infection rates? Does anything else jump out at you as interesting? Yeah. Yeah, so it's very striking. North Africa and the Middle East have among the world's lowest infection rates, despite, say, North Africa obviously having proximity to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a really striking difference where sub-Saharan Africa has 25 times the infection rate of North Africa, Middle East. Now, there are some interesting patterns even within sub-Saharan Africa that may relate to that. So one of the patterns in the data in sub-Saharan Africa is if you regress the HIV prevalence on proportion of population in a sub-Saharan African country that's Muslim, there's an incredible negative correlation. The more heavily Muslim population countries in sub-Saharan Africa have much less HIV infection than the predominantly Christian countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So to the extent that the North Africa Middle East region is overwhelmingly Muslim, that sort of is a pattern consistent with the pattern you even see in sub-Saharan Africa, and plausibly that relates to something to do with norms about sexual behavior. Some of it is also almost certainly related to the fact that the parts of West Africa and Central Africa within sub-Saharan Africa that are predominantly Muslim are also farther from the source of the epidemic, which was in the Great Lakes region of East Africa, basically. What other patterns jump out at people here, if any? I guess the U.S. is there. North America is there. And you can see that the infection rate in North America is higher than, say, in Western Europe and Central Europe, but still low relative to the African rate. Yeah.
I'm a little ignorant, but I was wondering if the extremely low HIV prevalence in East Asia was had to do with population control policies.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if what role the sort of one-child policy would play. East Asia, of course, is very far from the source of infection. I think it's kind of interesting question to see the difference between South and Southeast Asia versus East Asia because there are pretty big differences there. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Within Southeast Asia, early in the epidemic, there were several countries that had a lot of HIV. So Thailand was a sort of famous case of that, and people discussed what role the sort of commercial sex industry was playing in the spread of HIV in Thailand. So the nature of the commercial sex industry and social norms around sexual behavior and whatnot are clearly playing some sort of role in the spread. And then different countries also had very different control policies early on. So some countries were much more willing early on in the epidemic in the 80s and 90s to promote condom use and distribute condoms for free. And other countries, because of religious beliefs or religious restrictions, were less happy sort of promoting those sorts of policies, thinking they would promote casual sex. So there's a lot of different factors floating around. Yeah. No, these are really the best available data. So this is the UNAIDS data, which uses data from blood tests, which we'll talk about in the Kenyan case, attempts to get national prevalence figures through national surveys, through hospital records, and then lots of guesstimates. So the UNAIDS data has been criticized over the last 10 or 15 years because these sorts of numbers have moved around a lot, and the movement of these numbers around a lot really reflects our ignorance about what prevalence really is. Now, over time, we've been getting better and better data because there's been more and more attempts to get nationally representative prevalence data. So like this data is much more reliable than the data was even in 2005, for instance. And I'll talk about that in a couple slides. But it's supposed to be based on the best available biomedical data. Yeah.
We were talking about the U.S. response. I know that one of the reasons why the U.S. response was so slow is because HIV was infecting more of the gay community, and sort of a group that the political systems didn't really want to address. Were there histories like that in various African
HIV is so interesting because it's affected different populations in different communities in different settings. So in many of the Eastern European and Central Asian cases, HIV is really concentrated among intravenous drug abusers. And so that's another population, again, that may be very politically powerless or unpopular as well. In Western Europe and the United States in the 1980s, it was gay males who were overwhelmingly affected, although the disease, the epidemic has spread beyond that community since then. In sub-Saharan Africa, the bulk of transmission of HIV is thought to be through heterosexual sex. So it's so early on in the disease, there wasn't the same concentration among IV drug users or gay males that you saw in other parts of the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a couple slides. But the bulk of the victims, or the people living with HIV are not either gay or IV drug users in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so here's some of the statistics. Overall, since the start of the epidemic, and this was as of say 2010, over 60 million people have been infected. I mean, these are just massive numbers, and about 30 million have died of HIV-related causes. So this is already an epidemic that's literally killed tens of millions. It's something of absolutely massive scale. And as we saw before, there's still millions of people a year being infected. So the spread of the disease the spread of the virus has not stopped. And that's one of the questions we're going to ask. We probably won't get to today, but in the next lecture is why does the disease continue to spread when it's this deadly? And we'll try to talk about the decision-making behind it, the policy behind that spread. Now, even though the overall prevalence in sub-Saharan Africa is 5%, as I mentioned before, in Southern Africa, in some countries, over 15% of the population are HIV positive. So in those countries, there really is an incredibly high rate of infection. So there's 4 questions I want to talk about. I'm going to try to get through them in probably 2.5 lectures. I'm going to try to squeeze a little more in to get us back on schedule. The first is discussing the extent of the problem. We started that discussion now. In the last 10 minutes, we're going to continue a little bit more. Second, we're going to talk about the impacts of HIV/AIDS on economic development, try to talk through what the channels might be through which HIV would affect development outcomes. Then we're going to ask the question about why HIV continues to spread, this question I just posed, and finally start thinking about public policy responses. What are the interventions that might slow the spread of the disease, limit the impact of the disease, help promote the delivery of antiretroviral treatments to people who need them, etc. So there's a couple of different public policy responses we'll talk about. And the different papers on the reading list sort of correspond to these different questions broadly. So, and there's obviously a kind of a progression to these questions. We're going to try to understand the extent of the problem and then try to understand how to solve it. So I want to talk about this UNAIDS data again and talk about how much it's bounced around. So earlier in the epidemic, so about 10, 12 years ago, the UNAIDS estimate, so this is the United Nations agency tasked with dealing with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, their estimate for the proportion of Kenyan adults who are HIV positive was 15%. That's really high. It turns out that data was based on blood samples drawn from pregnant women who gave blood samples in antenatal clinics. Is that a reliable sample to be basing inference on? What's the kind of first reason why you might think that number would not be entirely accurate or not represent true prevalence? Yeah. Yeah, so they're pregnant, so they had to have had unprotected sex at some point. So this is already a sample of people who are having unprotected sex. That's why they're pregnant. So we're already dealing with a selected sample. Yeah. Speak up a little bit.
People wanted to get tested would go there. There would be a selection bias. It's not spread.
Right, so there could be some ability to refuse tests or agree to tests. There could be selection there. But if you're dealing with antenatal clinics, you're already dealing with people who had unprotected sex. So yeah. Yeah, so that's the other fundamental point is infection rates could be higher or lower for males and females. Let me just get people's sort of view now. This isn't a Clifford question, but your view. Do you guys think in the Kenyan data that I'll show you in a couple seconds, infection rates are higher for females? Raise your hand. Or higher for males? Okay, so most people, 2/3 say males and 1/3 say females. Okay, we'll get to the data in a couple seconds on that. So we're missing males. We're dealing with people who are having unprotected sex, and people may be able to refuse or agree with tests. So for all those reasons, we really don't have a sense of what the infection rate really is. Now, it turns out in 2003, so shortly after UNAIDS put out those 2001 estimates, the Demographic and Health Survey group, so there's a group that was originally based at the CDC and since then is independent, has expanded to many countries. The Demographic and Health Survey group has tried to collect consistent data on basically women's health. They mainly focus on surveying women throughout the world in dozens and dozens of countries, and they've run surveys in many African countries over time. So starting around 2003, they actually tried to get blood draws from respondents in African countries, and they tried to get nationally representative samples, and they tried to get blood draws from a representative sample of those respondents. And the goal of doing that was to get around the problem of dealing with antenatal clinic data and getting a representative sample. So that was the goal. I remember being at a sort of research meeting put on by the Social Science Research Council in early 2003, before the DHS started doing this, and it was supposed to focus on the economics of HIV, and a lot of us were just sitting around the table saying, we don't even know what prevalence is. Like, this is a disease that everybody's talking about, we know it's a big deal, we don't even know prevalence. How can we begin to deal with this challenge? So the DHS approach was really an attempt to get around this. Now, when they offered HIV tests, these were confidential tests, and people were told, respondents, look, no one's going to know your test result, and don't worry about us reporting it or anybody finding out. Still, only 3/4 of respondents agreed to be tested. So that isn't perfect. So even with this data, this is going to be a major issue. It isn't like 100% of the people offered the test took the test. There's still going to be some selection into testing. What is your guys' basic view? Do you think people who are more likely or less likely to be infected are more likely to get tested? Are people who are HIV positive more likely to get tested, or people who are HIV negative more likely to get tested? So most people's prior is that HIV negative people are probably more likely to get tested because they don't fear the inadvertent or inadvertent release of the information about their status. And there's some weak evidence that that's actually true. We'll talk about that a little bit in the Thornton piece. Okay, so if people who are more likely to be HIV negative are more likely to get tested, how reliable are the numbers that are going to come out of these estimates? Are they going to understate or overstate true prevalence? They're going to understate, obviously. Okay, so now we have one number we know overstates prevalence, and now we're going to get another number we know understates prevalence. But hey, at least we're getting some bounds. You know, we're bounding things. We're making progress. So in that year, they found that the prevalence rate was 6-point-something%, much lower than the 15%. And in some subsequent data, it's at even slightly lower. So at 6%, Kenya isn't that different than the 5% sub-Saharan Africa-wide prevalence that we found. It's a little higher. You know, it's in East Africa where there tends to be somewhat higher prevalence, but it's sort of broadly similar. But again, there are reasons to think this may understate true prevalence. So I don't know, maybe it's a couple points higher. And basically, the UN AIDS data is trying to take all these factors into account, looking at the coverage rate and making guesses about the infection rate. But what ended up happening from the early to mid-2000s till now are the global estimates of the number of people infected with HIV have fallen massively. And if you read the newspaper, sometimes the headline is UN AIDS says the number of people with AIDS, with HIV, has fallen dramatically. But really, it's a data construct. It's really just we didn't know what the infection rate was before, and now we have a better sense of it. Okay, a couple points on this. It's wonderful if we actually think there are, instead of, say, 45 million people infected, it's only 30 million. That's great. It means this terrible epidemic is affecting fewer people. 30 million people, though, is still a crazy amount of people to be infected with HIV/AIDS, as we'll talk about. So I think the concern of some people in the sort of HIV/AIDS advocacy world is with these new numbers and the disease not seeming like as big a deal, they're going to lose funding, they're going to lose influence, and so there's been this sort of, I think a lot of the folks in that world have been of two minds about the new data because they feel like it's going to take the wind out of their sails in terms of fundraising and programs to deal with HIV/AIDS. But given the scale of the problem, even with the new numbers, I think we can all agree this is a massive problem, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so which of these numbers is closer to the truth? We've already sort of talked through this issue. The number is definitely between 6.3 to 15%. I think most people would probably say it's closer to 6.3 than to 15. And when I show you a plot in a second, you'll see why. Yeah. It was done the same way, and they also had pretty good compliance with the test, but not perfect. And yeah. So I'm going to show you a plot of HIV infection rates for different demographic groups in Kenya. And I think if you look at that and try to think about it, we'll probably lean towards the 6 or 7% number being closer to the truth than a 15% number. Yeah.
How do response rates compare to countries?
There's quite a bit of variation. By now, there have been these DHS surveys in many African countries. I don't have it here, but there is some variation. Quite a bit of variation. So I remember the person who's put together a lot of the DHS data is there's a researcher named Demian de Walk, and he's the lead author on one of the papers on your guys' syllabus. He's at the World Bank, and he has probably half a dozen papers on these DHS data, really trying to understand patterns in the data and trying to understand if the response rate correlates with infection rates and all these kinds of things. He does a number of other really interesting things. Like for some of the DHS surveys, they also try to get data on men, the husbands of the women or the partners of the women who are surveyed, and he looks for the sort of match in the HIV status of the men and the women, for instance, and finds that there's a lot of what are called discordant couples. So because the risk of transmission in any one sexual act is actually very low, like much less than 1%, there are couples that are regularly having sex that don't infect each other for long periods of time. That's what he finds in some of his data. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it depends a lot on the society, and it's also evolved over time. There's a question here about taboo in terms of HIV/AIDS questions. In many societies, there's a very strong conventional wisdom that there's a lot of stigma against those who are HIV positive. The same way there has been in the U.S., and I think it's gone down in the U.S., but certainly in the 80s and 90s, there was tremendous stigma. As the availability of antiretrovirals has increased, and becoming HIV positive is no longer effectively a death sentence the way it was before, over time that's going to tend to reduce the stigma, because the disease is something that's less frightening to people, because it's less of a killer than it was before. So, yeah. It could be an explanation for changing selection bias over time, and the differences in the degree of taboo or stigma could affect testing rates. And I'm not sure if people have run that kind of analysis in terms of looking at survey data on the degree of stigma and also the compliance with the blood test. Maybe that's been done. I'm not sure. So let me show you a plot, and this gets back to the question of whether men or women have higher infection rates. So most of you thought men had higher infection rates, but actually women have much higher HIV infection rates in most African countries. And this is related to sexual behavior. It's related to the likelihood of infection for men and women in heterosexual intercourse. In heterosexual intercourse, a male is much more likely to infect a female than vice versa. And there's a lot of evidence of that, and that's a big part of this difference. So in some age groups, women have almost twice the prevalence of men. So that's one sort of stylized fact to put out there from the Kenya data. When it comes to a lot of the other African data, there's this big gap between women and men. Now again, in terms of this notion that Kenyan prevalence was 15%, if you think that most of the folks in those antenatal clinics were these women in their 20s, that's really like the peak prevalence group of any demographic group in this plot. So we're definitely overstating infection rates among adults if we're focusing on women in their 20s. So right away, you can see why that 15% number is just way too high. For men, it's much lower. So that's one difference. The gender difference is very striking, and this comes through many African countries. I want to talk about the age differences here. You see a certain pattern in many of these DHS surveys. Among young people, infection rates are very low, and the reason why infection rates are low is these are individuals in their late teens who are just becoming sexually active, and therefore at greater risk of infection. Now, some kids are born HIV positive because their mother was HIV positive, but the numbers are relatively low right now, and before the availability of ARVs, antiretrovirals, those kids very rarely live to be 15 to 19 years of age. So by the time folks were becoming sexually active, almost all were HIV negative. But you see an increasing prevalence as people get older. It's incredibly striking how much higher the prevalence is for women in the late teen years. For men, there's almost no infection among late teens, but